The inspection request came through official channels, which should have been the first sign something was wrong. The Verath Collective didn't do official channels. They did broad-spectrum jamming followed by boarding parties. They did unilateral docking at stations that hadn't agreed to be docked at. They did the particular brand of diplomatic communication that starts with a plasma lance pointed at a fuel depot and ends with a treaty that, functionally, only one party has read. For 18 months running, the Joint Liaison Office had filed 47 formal complaints with the Collective's Concord Secretariat, and the Collective had responded to every single one of them by filing a counter-complaint, in triplicate, written in a script that our translation matrix still couldn't fully parse, accusing humanity of something that the closest approximation in English came out as aggressive approachability. There had been a 3-hour meeting about that translation. 6 people in a conference room at Warden Station, a Terran linguistics officer, 2 collective-assigned interpreters who each claimed the other was misreading the idiomatic register, and a deputy liaison chief who kept asking if perhaps it was a compliment. It was not a compliment. We eventually settled on a working translation of excessive willingness to engage at proximity without establishing subordinate relationship first, which is to say, we were too friendly and it was threatening them, which tells you most of what you need to know about the Verath Collective. So when a properly formatted, correctly addressed, legitimately authenticated request arrived in my inbox asking if a Handler Corps NCO and 1 credentialed K9 unit would accompany a Verath fleet inspection of the shared transit corridor around waypoint Orin 7, I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, because the authentication codes were correct, and the routing header was correct, and it had come through the official diplomatic relay, and not through the usual back channel that we used when the Collective wanted to communicate something without technically admitting they were communicating it. Then I forwarded it to Colonel Maresh with a note that said only, "Something is off." Her reply came back in 4 minutes, "Agreed, you're going." My name is Darren Akafer. I am, as of this assignment, a Chief Warrant Officer in the Terran Handler Corps, attached to the 8th Liaison Detachment, based on the orbital platform Warden Station above Orin 7. Prior to the Corps, I spent 11 years as an explosive ordnance technician, which is a job with a very specific requirement for comm. You do not get to be nervous about things that will kill you if you drop them. You develop a particular relationship with objects that look inert but aren't, a professional respect for the gap between appearance and capability. After 11 years of that, the Handler Corps seemed like a natural next step. The skills translated almost perfectly. Sergeant had been with me for 6 years. He was a Beagle, 22 kilos, floppy ears, a brown and white coat with a saddle of darker brown across his back and shoulders. His coat always looked slightly dusty regardless of how recently he'd been groomed. I don't know if that's a Beagle thing or a sergeant thing. The grooming records suggest it's a sergeant thing, because the kennel techs have tried various approaches and the dusty appearance persists. He carries it with the equanimity of an animal that has decided aesthetics are not his department. His nose was something else. The Corps biochemistry team published a 40-page monograph on working Beagle olfactory capability about 3 years into our partnership. Sergeant wasn't the subject animal. The study was done on 6 different working Beagles across 4 detachments, but his detection logs were included in the dataset. The monograph's central finding was that a trained working Beagle operating in a standard detection deployment identifies target compounds at a discrimination level approximately 40 times more precise than any manufactured sensor array in current Terran production. Not 40 times more sensitive. The arrays can sometimes beat the nose on raw signal detection in perfectly controlled conditions. 40 times more discriminating. The ability to pick a specific compound out of a complex chemical environment, to find the exact thing and not everything around it, and to do it while moving, while cataloging a new space, while an alien delegation watches with undisguised skepticism from the other end of a corridor. The monograph was 73 pages long and concluded, in its final paragraph, that the most cost-effective approach to explosive and contraband detection in contested transit environments remained a trained working Beagle on a standard lead. Sargent did not know about the monograph. He knew about the lead, which he tolerated with the patient dignity of an animal that had decided, long ago, that most things humans attached to him were beneath his formal objection. He also knew about the treat pouch on my left hip, which he monitored with an attentiveness that was, in its own way, more focused than anything I'd encountered in 11 years of ordnance work. We boarded the Vereth Flagship Unbroken Doctrine at 900 station time. I had a transit window of 30 minutes from Warden's docking arm to the collective's vessel, and I used it to review the inspection brief one more time, to run through the manifest confirmation, and to give Sargent a drink of water and one of the reward pieces I keep in the right side pouch. Not the treat pouch, the right side pouch, which he doesn't monitor as closely because the reward pieces only come from there when I need him awake and calibrated before a deployment. He took it, chewed it, looked at me, and then looked at the docking collar ahead with the expression he always wears when we're about to work. Ears slightly forward, tail at the steady working arc, body loose and unhurried. That expression is worth more to me than most briefing documents. The ship was large. That's the most honest thing I can say about it. Terran vessels are designed around efficiency. The corridors are functional. The materials are chosen for weight and durability. The layout makes operational sense. The Unbroken Doctrine was designed around something else entirely. Presence, maybe, or the architectural equivalent of a very long declaration. The corridors were broad enough to drive a transport through, lined with panels of a dark, striated material that absorbed light in a way that made the overhead fixtures seem insufficient, as though the ship itself was consuming the illumination rather than allowing it to function. The ceilings were high, 3-4 meters in most sections, and curved inward at the top, which gave every space the faint impression of standing inside something's throat. The air was cool and carried a trace of something organic, like damp stone and old mineral water, with an undercurrent of something I couldn't identify that Sargent clearly could, because his nose went up the moment we cleared the docking collar. He didn't stop walking. He just breathed, long and thorough, the way he does at the start of every new space, that initial cataloging inhale that maps the baseline chemistry of the environment so that anything that doesn't fit it will register as anomalous. I've watched him do it 1,000 times in 1,000 different corridors. It looks like nothing. It is, in my professional experience, the most thorough reconnaissance method available to a two-person team working on a budget. The welcoming delegation was already assembled in the entry corridor, 40 meters in. There were 8 of them. The Vereth run large. The smallest in the group stood about 180 centimeters, and the largest, stationed at the rear and flanked by 2 armored guards, stood closer to 230. They were slate blue, most of them, with the layered dermal plating that develops in Vereth adults from the shoulder to the jaw, a structural feature that looks like armor but is biological, and that I had been told in my collective cultural briefing represents both a maturity marker and a status signal, in the same way that gray hair reads differently in different human cultures. The 2 flanking guards had plating that extended further down the arm, onto the forearm and back of the hand. Combat grade, the briefing had called it, don't touch it. They moved with the particular stillness that signals, in any species, a very deliberate effort not to react. They were dressed in formal inspection colors, dark gray with gold circuit work at the collar and cuffs, and every one of them was watching Sargent. Not me, Sargent. I noted this and said nothing. The thing that often gets lost in the retelling, in the versions that exist that I have heard, the ones where it becomes something cleaner and more dramatic than it was, is how unremarkable the first several minutes felt. There was no tension that a visitor unfamiliar with the work would have identified as tension. There was a delegation. There was a handler and a dog. There was a formal inspection protocol that both parties had agreed to in writing. Every person in that corridor was doing, on the surface, exactly what they were supposed to be doing. What was not on the surface was the specific quality of the silence when Vel looked at Sargent. I have a professional sensitivity to silences, developed across 11 years of ordnance work and 6 years of handler corps deployments. Silences have different textures, and the texture of this one was assessment. Not the assessment of something unfamiliar. Vel's intelligence briefings had surely included Terran handler corps methodology, the use of working dogs in detection roles, the corps certification framework. He knew what Sargent was in the taxonomic sense. He was assessing what Sargent was worth. Running the calculation of small domestic animal against the specific technical system he had deployed for this inspection, and arriving at an answer that the evidence in front of him supported completely, and that the next several hours would revise without mercy. That is not Vel's failure. That is what available evidence does when it's incomplete. It generates confident conclusions. The failure, if there is one, is in not keeping some fraction of uncertainty, some operational humility about the gap between what the technology confirms and what is actually there. Sargent has no opinion on this. He doesn't deal in confidence or uncertainty. He deals in chemical signatures and trained indication behaviors and liver treats. His epistemology is cleaner than ours. The largest one, the one with the guards, stepped forward. His name was Fleet Admiral Doreth Vel. I knew this from the briefing materials Colonel Marish had sent, which also included a psychological profile summarizing him as highly status-conscious, punitive toward perceived informality, and unlikely to engage productively with any party he has pre-assessed as subordinate. The profile had been written by a liaison specialist named Cho, who had clearly spent time around Vel and emerged from that experience with both professional detachment and what I can only describe as a very focused dislike. Cho's profiles were useful precisely because they didn't editorialize. Every word was documented behavior, logged interaction, cited precedent. The profile didn't say Vel was difficult. It described, in careful operational language, a specific pattern of behavior that amounted to the same thing and gave you the tactical framework to work within it. Vel wore more gold at his collar than the others, and he held himself the way certain men hold themselves when they have never once, in their entire adult life, been told that they were wrong. Not arrogance. Exactly, arrogance implies awareness of a gap between what you believe and what might be true. This was something more settled. A man who has stopped checking the assumption because the assumption has never needed checking. He looked at Sargent for a long moment. Then he said something in Verath that the translation chip in my ear rendered as, "You have brought an animal." "Credentialed working unit," I said. Per the Inspection Protocol, Section 9, Paragraph 4, organic detection systems are authorized for use in transit corridor surveys. He's listed on the manifest. Vel looked at the manifest tablet one of his aides was holding, then back at Sargent. His expression was that of a man reading a document that says something he considers to be technically true but operationally irrelevant. "It is small," he said. "He's a beagle," I said. "Canis lupus familiaris working subspecies, olfactory detection." "We have sensor arrays," Vel said, "calibrated to detect all known Terran ordnance signatures and 67 chemical compound classes. They completed 3 sweeps of the inspection corridor in the past 48 hours. "Yes," I said. There was a pause. "That animal," Vel said, "is beneath notice." He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way you say a fact, a thing so obviously true that stating it is almost a courtesy to the slower people in the room. He said it, and then he turned, and his delegation turned with him, and they began to walk. I looked down at Sargent. Sergeant was looking at the corridor ahead, not at Vel, not at the delegation, at the corridor itself, his nose moving in the small, precise way it does when there's something in the air worth tracking. His tail was at the working arc. I gave the lead a small amount of slack, and we followed. I want to describe the corridor walk in some detail, because it's important, and because I spent a portion of the next several weeks wishing I had been less focused on the diplomatic mechanics and more focused on what I was watching. We walked for about 12 minutes before we reached the inspection section. The corridor changed character as we moved deeper into the ship. The entry section had been high-ceilinged and processional, designed to communicate something to visitors. The working sections were more compact, the ceiling dropping to 2 meters, the wall paneling shifting from the dark striated material to something denser and lighter in color, with a different surface texture that I couldn't name but that smelled, faintly, of mineral processing. The delegation ahead of us moved with a collective efficiency that suggested they'd walked this route before, which they had. This was their ship, these were their corridors. They moved like a body through a familiar space. The armored guards had repositioned during the first 2 minutes of walking, pulling back from their flanking positions beside Vel to a trailing formation that put them about 3 meters behind me and Sergeant. Not threatening, not subtle either. I logged it, I kept moving. Sergeant walked beside me on the loose lead and cataloged everything. I have tried over the years to explain to people outside the handler corps what this process actually looks like, because the usual mental image is of a dog with his nose to the ground, sniffing loudly, clearly engaged. Sergeant doesn't do that on a working deployment. He walks normally or close to it. His nose moves, there's a slight flare at the nostril, a rhythm to his breathing that's different from his resting rate, but nothing that reads, to a casual observer, as active work. What is actually happening is that he is running every molecule of air in his environment through a biological sensor array that took 14 months of training to calibrate and 6 years of operational experience to optimize. And he is building, in real time, a complete chemical map of the spaces we're moving through. He does it continuously. He does it automatically. He cannot turn it off any more than I can turn off my vision. The first 2 sections of the inspection were uneventful by any visible measure. Vel's aides ran their scanner arrays down the corridor panels and logged readings into their documentation systems. I walked. Sergeant walked. The scanner arrays beeped occasionally in the way scanner arrays beep when they're working and finding nothing. Every 10 meters or so, one of the aides would file a reading, and Vel would acknowledge it with a small nod, and we would continue. At one point, Vel looked back at Sergeant and said something to the aide beside him that my chip rendered as, "The animal follows without purpose." The aide responded with something I didn't catch fully, but which included the word for Terran protocol in a tone that communicated professional distance from what it was being asked to implement. I filed that too. In the second section, one of the armored guards, the taller one who had repositioned to the left side of the corridor 2 sections back, moved to walk closer to us. Not aggressive in any way that would have been formally documentable, just closer. He looked down at Sergeant with the expression of someone who has decided, in advance of any evidence, what something is, and is confirming that decision by looking. Sergeant didn't look at him. That is not a trained behavior. Sergeant will look at things that interest him or that register as requiring attention. He didn't look at the guard because the guard, to Sergeant's operational assessment, was not interesting and did not require attention. The guard was not a chemical anomaly. He was not a threat vector. He was ambient. Sergeant's nose was doing more important things. The guard looked at Sergeant for another 3 seconds, then looked at me, then looked away. We reached the third section at approximately 9:37. The logistical access corridor, longer than the previous 2 sections, about 45 meters end to end, I estimated, with the lighter, denser wall paneling that I'd noticed in the transition. Maintenance access corridor was the manifest designation. runs alongside the main cargo routing spine. The briefing had flagged this section as the primary survey area, the section where the 3-sweep sensor arrays had confirmed clean. Sergeant's nose went to the left wall and stayed there. He moved along it slowly. Not fast, not urgent, slow and deliberate, the way a good working dog moves when the signal is getting stronger. 3 steps. 4. I watched his tail, because the tail is where the certainty reads, the slow, almost mechanical arc that means, in working beagles, not happiness but confirmation. The chemical signal hitting his olfactory map and registering as known, as filed, as this is what I was looking for. He sat down. He sat down facing the left wall panel at a point roughly 2 meters from a maintenance access seam, and he turned his head and looked at me, and he waited. I stopped walking. The delegation ahead of me continued for 3 more steps before Vel noticed I had stopped, and then he stopped, and the delegation stopped with him, because when the handler stops walking, something has happened. He's indicated, I said. Vel turned. He looked at Sergeant. Sergeant was still sitting, still looking at me, still waiting. His tail made one slow sweep across the deck plating and then stilled. Your animal, Vel said slowly, has sat down. His indication behavior, I said, passive alert, means he's located a target compound. Vel looked at the wall panel. It looked like every other wall panel in the corridor. It looked like exactly nothing. Your sensors have found nothing, he said. 3 sweeps. Yes, I said. I'm aware. One of Vel's senior aides, a Verath officer whose designation I had in the manifest as technical command, which meant he oversaw the sensor arrays, said something in Verath that came through clearly enough. The arrays had swept this specific panel twice in addition to the general corridor sweeps. Clean red each time. He said it with the confidence of a person whose confidence is entirely reasonable given the available evidence, which is a specific kind of confidence I have encountered before in my career, and which I treat with a careful respect. I understand, I said. I'd like to open the panel. Vel looked at the panel for a long moment. Then he looked at Sergeant. Sergeant had adjusted his position slightly. He was sitting more squarely now, directly facing the panel, his chin level, his body very still except for the slow respirations that meant he was continuing to sample the air and continuing to confirm the find. Your unit, Vel said, is a small earth animal that has sat down next to a wall. Yes, I said. Our sensor arrays have logged this panel as clean, 3 sweeps, additional targeted readings, clean. Yes, I said. And you are requesting permission to open a panel on a Verath fleet vessel based on the behavior of a small Earth animal. Based on the indication behavior of a credentialed core detection unit, I said. Per Section 9, Paragraph 7 of the Joint Inspection Protocol, a positive canine indication constitutes grounds for physical inspection of the indicated location. I paused. I'd like to open the panel. With your permission, Admiral. The last part delivered flat without emphasis, because emphasis would have made it a challenge. It wasn't a challenge. It was information about how the next 3 minutes could proceed, and Vel was a man who understood information about how things could proceed. He was quiet for a long moment. I looked at Sergeant. Sergeant was looking at the panel. His ears were slightly forward and his tail had gone back to the slow arc, still confirming, still certain, entirely unbothered by the political texture of what was happening around him. He had done his job. He was waiting for the humans to do theirs. Vel said something to his aide in Verath. The chip rendered it as, humor the Terran and his dirt animal, log the panel opening formally. When it finds nothing, we close this and move on. The aide produced an access tool and opened the panel. Inside the wall cavity, between the main panel backing and the secondary structural layer, packed into a space roughly 40 centimeters deep and 1.5 meters wide, were 47 individually wrapped composite charges. I identified the type in approximately 4 seconds. Terran EOD had been looking for a batch of these for about 14 months, since 3 logistics ships had passed through the Orin 7 transit corridor and arrived at their destinations lighter than they'd departed, and the discrepancy in mass matched, to within measurement error, what 47 composite charges of this type and packing configuration would weigh. They were Verath manufactured. The wrapping material was Verath standard issue. The packing arrangement, the specific way the units were nestled against each other in the cavity, the orientation, the spacing, matched a collective field logistics protocol that appeared in 2 previous EOD incident reports. I confirmed this via the core scanner I had been carrying in my kit since before we boarded, which I took out and ran over the cavity contents with the unhurried methodology of a man who is being very careful to produce documentation that will hold up under any future review. The scanner returned a batch profile match on the activation signatures. 14 months of investigation, represented in one confirmation tone from a device the size of my palm. I put the scanner away. Sergeant looked at the open panel. He looked at me. He accepted the piece of dried liver I removed from the treat pouch on my left hip, chewed it with the focused efficiency of a working animal taking a reward, and then looked back at the panel with the mild expression of an animal that has completed a task and is available for the next one. The corridor was quiet. Not the quiet of an empty space, the quiet of a space that has suddenly reorganized itself around a new fact, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses on the air. I have been in a lot of quiet spaces in my career. The moment after a controlled detonation, when the echo is still settling into the structural walls. The moment when a team has just realized how close something was, and the adrenaline has receded enough to let the understanding through. This particular quiet was different from both of those. It was the quiet of 14 Verath delegation members standing in a corridor on their own flagship, looking at 47 charges that their own sensor arrays had cleared 3 times, that a 22-kilo Earth dog had found in approximately 4 minutes and 30 seconds of unhurried work. No one spoke. Vel was looking at the cache, not at me, not at Sergeant, at the cache with the expression of a man who is running through a very specific and very uncomfortable calculation, the kind of calculation that has a clear answer and a clear implication and no route to a different conclusion. He had assessed Sergeant as beneath notice. He had said so in front of his delegation in a way that was not ambiguous. He had then watched Sergeant walk 40 meters of corridor, sit down in front of a wall panel his arrays had cleared, and be right. The expression on his face wasn't fury. It wasn't the theatrical humiliation of a man publicly embarrassed. It was quieter than that. It was the look of a man standing inside a conclusion he made himself. I took out my comm and opened a secure channel to Warden Station. Akefer to Warden, I said. Positive find. Composite charges, Verath manufacture, 47 units, wall cavity in logistical access corridor, Section 3, unbroken doctrine. Request EOD team and liaison officer. Evidence protocol from point of find. A brief pause, then Colonel Marish's voice, flat and professional. Confirmed. Team is moving. Estimated transit time 14 minutes. Keep the corridor sealed. Understood. I closed the channel. The aide who had opened the panel had taken a half step back from the cavity. His scanner was in his hand, and he was looking between it and the cavity contents with an expression that read, across the species gap, as someone conducting a manual recalculation against a result they cannot explain. His arrays should have caught this. The arrays had been calibrated to detect 67 compound classes. Composite charges of this type were not a new compound class. There was no technical reason the arrays should have missed them, which meant the technical reason was something other than the sensor's capability. I let him work through that. It wasn't my calculation to interrupt. Vel still hadn't spoken. His delegation had gone into the stillness of a group waiting for an authority figure to indicate how to respond. One of the armored guards near the rear had shifted his weight minutely, a tell that might mean something or might mean nothing, and which I filed without action, because the situation was already heading in the only direction it could head, and adding physical tension to it would not improve the direction. Sergeant had gotten up from his sit. He was standing beside my left leg, nose working at the open cavity in that curious, unhurried way that means he is cataloging new information, the smell of the exposed composite material, the air from inside the wall cavity, whatever else the space contained. He was not alerting on anything new. He was just thorough. He's always thorough. In 6 years, I have never caught him cutting the work short. I waited. The waiting was easy for me because I have made a professional practice of it. I have stood next to things that could kill me and waited for teams to arrive. I have stood in rooms where the balance of power was unclear and waited for the balance to resolve. Waiting is not passive. It is a discipline. You fill it with attention and you don't fill it with noise. Vel turned to look at me. His expression had changed. Not dramatically, this was not a man given to dramatic expression, but the settled quality that had been in his bearing since the docking collar, the particular weight of a man who has never needed to recalibrate, was different now. Lighter, maybe. Or more precisely, less certain of its own density. "Your unit," he said after a long moment. "Yes," I said. "Located this." "Yes." He looked at Sergeant. Sergeant looked at the wall cavity with the mild continuing interest of an animal confirming what it already knows. "Our arrays," Vel said and then stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. There was no way to finish it that went somewhere useful. I didn't try to finish it for him. The silence was doing the work. Adding words to it would only have diluted the work. Vel looked at me for another 3 seconds, then turned and spoke to the senior aide in Verath, low, clipped, the tone of operational instruction rather than status performance. The aide responded immediately. In the next 2 minutes, 3 of the delegation members were dispatched back into the ship's interior, presumably to notify relevant personnel and begin whatever internal protocols applied to finding 47 composite charges in a wall cavity during a joint inspection. I watched Vel through this and noted that he moved with the same economy he had moved with since we'd boarded. No agitation, no hurry, no visible disruption of his operational bearing. He was recalculating, but he was doing it cleanly. Whatever the charges were there for, and whoever had put them there, Vel had enough professional instinct to understand that how the next 40 minutes proceeded would matter. The EOD team and Colonel Marish's liaison officer, a young warrant officer named Tavers, arrived 13 minutes and 40 seconds after my call. The corridor sealed behind them. The evidence process began. I want to describe this part carefully also, because it's where the story usually gets simplified into something cleaner than it was. The joint evidence protocol means both parties document everything, every unit cataloged, every scan logged, every chain of custody signature collected from both a Terran officer and a collective documentation officer before anything moves. It is a slow process, deliberately. It is designed to be slow because the slowness creates a record that neither party can later dispute without disputing their own documentation. The collective's documentation officers were professional. They worked alongside our team without delay or obstruction. They signed where they were required to sign. The technical command aide, whose scanner arrays had missed the find, stood to one side and watched with the focused attention of a man conducting his own internal investigation into how his technology had performed, and whether the performance gap was in the technology or in something else. Vel remained in the corridor for 12 minutes after Tavers' team arrived. He spoke briefly with a collective logistics officer who had been summoned from elsewhere on the ship. A short exchange in Verath, that my chip caught most of but that I chose not to log because it was internal to the collective and not operationally relevant to the evidence process. Then he left. His departure was quiet. No speech. No final look in my direction. He simply turned and walked, with the same measured economy he'd moved with all morning, back into the interior of his flagship. I watched him go and thought, he'll be fine. Not fine the way a man is fine when nothing has happened to him. Fine the way a man is fine who is very good at surviving the things that happen to him. Sub-Administrator Tyne Vralt stayed. He was a younger Verath officer, the plating lighter, less extensive, the posture carrying a different kind of stillness than Vel's. Where Vel's stillness had been the stillness of certainty, Vralt's was the stillness of someone paying close attention. He stood at a respectful distance while our team worked, and he watched Sargent with an attention that was different from the attention of anyone else in the delegation. Not contemptuous, not alarmed. Something more like recalculation in progress, the specific expression of a person updating a model. About 20 minutes into the evidence collection, he stepped closer to me. "Your detection unit," he said, in careful Terran standard. He had a slight accent and a very precise grammar that suggested formal language training rather than conversational exposure. "The Beagle." "Sergeant," I said. "Sergeant," he said it like he was filing it. He detected these through the panel material, while our arrays did not. "Correct. The arrays are sophisticated. 67 compound classes, 3 corridor sweeps, plus the additional targeted readings in this section." "I understand." "And the animal," he paused. "Sergeant, how long did it take him?" "From when we entered the section, about 4.5 minutes." Vralt was quiet for a moment. He was watching Sargent, who was lying on the deck plating about 2 meters from the open cavity, chin on his paws, watching the evidence team work with the calm interest of an animal that has identified the most comfortable available position and occupied it. "He is trained specifically for this work," Vralt said. "For olfactory detection, yes. Composite explosive compounds are one of his certified categories. He also has certifications in biological contaminants and several other classes that I'm not cleared to specify in this setting." "And the training took how long?" "Core certification, 14 months. We've been a team for 6 years, so he has 6 years of operational experience on top of the baseline training. He runs calibration exercises twice a week between deployments to keep the indication behaviors current." Vralt nodded slowly. He was still watching Sargent, and Sargent was still watching the evidence team, and the evidence team was still methodically cataloging 47 composite charges. "The sensory capability itself," Vralt said, "is it a product of the training or inherent to the animal?" "Both," I said. "The nose is biological, that's what beagles are built with. It's been the defining characteristic of the breed for centuries. The training channels it. Teaches him the target profile, teaches him to indicate a find in a way that's operationally useful, teaches him to work in complex environments without being distracted by irrelevant signals. But you can't train the capability into an animal that doesn't have it. The platform has to be right first. And this platform, the Beagle, it is a common Earth animal. As a breed, yes, common enough. Working detection subspecies like Sargent are selected specifically. You're looking for animals with the right nose, the right temperament, the right trainability. But beagles as a breed are widespread. They've been human companions and working animals for several hundred years." Vralt absorbed this. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he was done, and then he said, "The Admiral's assessment was that the organic detection system would function as a formality, that the sensor arrays would confirm an empty section, the joint inspection would close without a positive find, and we would proceed." He wasn't asking me to comment on this. He was stating it with the precision of someone who intends to be accurate about what has occurred. I'm not in a position to comment on the Admiral's assessment, I said. I'm not asking you to, he said. And then, with the specific inflection of someone asking you to do exactly that, I'm noting it for accuracy. Noted, I said. He looked at Sergeant for another moment. In the collective's internal taxonomy, he said, we classify detection-capable organisms in a specific category. Animals selected and maintained for sensory function. We use them in deep survey operations in environments where our manufactured arrays are insufficient. They carry a formal designation, not a military rank but a recognized status, an acknowledgement that the organism's capability is, he paused, choosing the word carefully, constitutive. Not built by training but present in the nature of the animal, and refined by training. What's the designation? He gave me the Verath word, which my chip rendered as something I can't reproduce phonetically, and then said, the closest rendering in Terran Standard would be something like instrument of the old precision, meaning a thing whose capability is not manufactured but is inherent. The technology confirms it. The animal simply is. I looked at him. Sergeant would appreciate that, I said, if he understood it, which he doesn't because he is a dog. Vralt's expression shifted by approximately 2 millimeters, the corner of the mouth, the slight crease at the outer eye, in a way that read, across the species gap, as something you might call a smile if you were being generous with the taxonomy. Of course, he said, and made a notation on his tablet and went back to watching the evidence team. We finished at 1740 station time. The joint inspection was formally closed. The unbroken doctrine was placed under collective internal review. The charges transferred to a Terran evidence facility at Warden Station under joint seal. I signed the final documentation. Vralt countersigned for the collective. The documentation officers filed their copies. Tavers sent the chain of custody package to the Joint Liaison Office. Then we walked back through the corridor toward the docking collar. The delegation was gone. They dispersed during the evidence work, filtered back into the ship in ones and twos until by the time we were walking out, the corridor was just ours, mine and Sergeant's and Tavers' team ahead of us, their footsteps and the quiet sound of equipment being stowed. The overhead lights seemed more adequate than they had on the way in. The ceiling didn't feel as much like a throat. At the docking collar, Vralt appeared from a side passage and fell into step alongside me for the last 10 meters. He didn't say anything until we reached the collar threshold, and then he said, the formal inquiry request. From the Secretariat, it will come through official channels. I'll watch for it, I said. They will want to understand the detection unit's capabilities, he said, the methodology, the training basis. He paused, the biological basis. There's a published monograph, I said, 73 pages, I can provide a reference. That would be appropriate, he said, and then, there will also be a secondary inquiry, separate from the technical one. He looked at Sergeant. They will want to know if this specific unit is available for future joint inspection work. I looked at him. They will want Sergeant specifically, he said, by name. He's a Beagle, I said. That, Vralt said, is now known. He turned and walked back into the ship. I stood at the collar threshold for a moment, then led Sergeant through and onto the transit shuttle, and we sat down, and I put the tablet on my knee and started the incident report. Sergeant put his chin on my thigh. I scratched him behind the ear. He made the low sound he makes when that specific spot is hit correctly, not a groan exactly, more of a settling sound like something releasing, and then closed his eyes. The shuttle pulled away from the unbroken doctrine's docking clamp. Out the viewport, the flagship's hull moved past, dark, striated, still communicating presence and declaration, and all the architectural vocabulary of a ship built to tell people what they were dealing with, and then it was behind us, and then it was gone. Sergeant slept. I wrote the report. The narrative section was 2 paragraphs. The The detection log was the attached form with boxes to check and fields to fill. Under Outcome of Detection Deployment, I wrote, Positive find confirmed. 47 composite charges, Verath manufacture, location, wall cavity, logistical access corridor, section 3, subject vessel. No sensor array flagging prior to canine indication. Find confirmed via independent EOD scanner on site. Under Unit Performance, I wrote, Standard. Consistent with training and certification. Which is accurate. That is exactly what it was. Colonel Marish called me into her office 2 days after we got back. She had the incident report on her screen and the evidence transfer confirmations and a separate file that she turned face down on her desk when I came in, which meant it was either a commendation or a complaint. She turned things face down when she wanted to tell you about them in person rather than let you read them cold. The collective's Concord Secretariat, she said, has submitted 2 formal inquiry requests. She looked at her screen. The first is technical. They want the training methodology, the certification standards, and the, I'm quoting, biological and developmental basis of the sensory capability demonstrated by the Terran Canine Detection Unit during the Orin 7 joint inspection. They want to know how the Beagle works. I can write them a summary, I said. There's a published monograph. I'll send them the monograph, she said. That's not the one I called you in about. She turned the face-down file over. It was a commendation, handler course citation, signed by the detachment commander and countersigned by the station liaison officer. Sergeant's full designation was at the top, Sergeant 7 Detection Unit, 8th Liaison Detachment, Terran Handler Corps, and below it the citation language, exemplary performance. Significant contribution to joint inspection outcome, in accordance with Corps standards. The second inquiry, Marish said, is from the collective's Operational Inspection Division. They want Sergeant available for a joint corridor survey in the Orin 9 approach in 4 months. They requested him by name. She looked at me. They specifically noted that they want the same unit from the Orin 7 inspection. They were quite clear. They want the Beagle, I said. They want the Beagle, she confirmed. We looked at each other. His schedule is mine to set, I said. I'll check availability and flag it. I thought you'd say that, she said and made a note. I walked back through the station to the kennel section. Sergeant was in his space, one ear folded against the bedding in the way it goes when he's deeply asleep and hasn't adjusted his position in a while. The kennel tech, Priya, was at the station desk. She looked up when I came in. He's been out since you got back, she said. Ate well, no issues. Good, I said. I crouched at the door of his space and looked at him. He cracked one eye, the eye on the side of the ear that wasn't folded under, registered that it was me, and closed it again. I stayed there for a moment. 6 years, 40-odd deployments. A monograph I've read enough times that certain sections come back to me without prompting. 47 composite charges in a wall cavity that had been swept clean 3 times by a sensor, array calibrated to 67 compound classes. The Concord Secretariat wants to know how he works. I could write them the answer if I wanted to. I could walk them through the olfactory biology, the receptor density, the training protocol, the certification framework, the twice-weekly calibration exercises. I could give them the monograph and the 6-year operational log and a detailed breakdown of every indication he's made in documented deployments. I could give them Vrault's taxonomy, instrument of the old precision, which is genuinely better than most people manage. What I couldn't give them is the thing that would fully answer the question. Because the thing that would fully answer the question is not in any file. It is 22 kilos of Beagle, asleep in a kennel on Warden Station, with one ear folded wrong and no outstanding concerns, who walked into a Flagship corridor and found in 4 minutes and 30 seconds what 3 sensor sweeps had not found in 48 hours, because that is what he does, inherently, without drama or performance or any particular awareness of the weight of what it means. He doesn't know about the charges. He doesn't know about the evidence locker on Warden Station, or the joint inquiry, or the administrative review happening right now somewhere in the collective's internal structure. He doesn't know that Vralt's notation on his tablet will eventually become part of a formal collective assessment on Terran organic detection capability. He doesn't know that Vel is, at this moment, answering questions from his own superiors about how 47 composite charges ended up in a wall cavity on his flagship. 3 weeks after the inspection, I was running Sergeant through a calibration set in one of the station's lower cargo bays. Controlled environment, sealed containers, target compounds hidden in a rotation that I vary so the patterns don't calcify, when Priya came in with a message flag. I told Sergeant to wait. He sat immediately and watched me with the steady patience of an animal that has internalized the command as architecture, not request. I read the flag. The collective's conquered secretariat had issued a formal designation. Sergeant 7, Detection Unit, 8th Liaison Detachment, Terran Handler Corps, recognized under Collective Provisional Order 44VN as a certified sensory asset of distinguished capability. The designation came with a 3-page explanatory document covering the formal definition, the operational parameters of the recognition, and the specific circumstances of the Orin 7 inspection that had prompted the review. At the bottom, in a section labeled Administrative Notes, the section that formal documents have because the formal language doesn't always fully land, and sometimes someone has to add a line that says what the document is actually trying to say, someone had written. The collective recognizes that the designation does not fully capture the nature of the asset. It is the closest available categorization. I read that twice. Then I put the message away. "All right," I said. Sergeant looked at me. His tail was already moving. He knew the calibration run wasn't finished, and he was waiting for the signal. I gave the signal. He went back to work. We finished the run clean, every find logged, every indication correct. Every reward delivered at the precise moment, and in the precise ratio that keeps the behavior chain intact and reliable. By the time we secured, the cargo bay had the particular quality of a space where work has been done well, and everyone present knows it. I clipped the lead back on, and we walked out into the station corridor. The ordinary sounds of Warden Station moving through its day, cargo handlers and maintenance personnel, and the distant cycle of atmospheric processors, other people's conversations in adjacent corridors, the faint hum of the docking arm mechanisms that never fully goes quiet. Sergeant walked beside me on the loose lead with his nose working and his tail at the steady arc, cataloging the world the way he always does, building the map, filing the inventory, finding everything in order. Somewhere in the collective's administrative system, a designation had been issued. A taxonomy had been adjusted. A sub-administrator had made a notation that would work its way up through the formal review structure and eventually become a line in an operational policy document that would change how the collective approached joint inspections with Terran handler teams. Not because of a treaty or a negotiation or an act of force, because a Beagle sat down in front of a wall panel and waited. Sergeant didn't know any of that. He knew about the lead. He knew about the treat pouch and the right side pouch and the difference between them. He knew about the ear scratch that would come, eventually, when we got back to the kennel section and the working day was formally closed. He knew about the liver treats and the calibration exercises and the way I say his name when the indication is confirmed, a particular tone that means, "That's the one, the real one, good work." That is the full scope of what he knows about any of this. It has always been sufficient. It will go on being sufficient. That is what I wrote in the narrative section of the follow-up report that the liaison office requested after the collective's formal designation came through. 2 paragraphs, clear language, no editorializing. Standard unit. Standard deployment. Standard outcome. Some truths are best put in writing exactly that way. I have been thinking in the weeks since about the taxonomy error and where it comes from. It's not stupidity. Vell is not a stupid man. His sensor arrays were genuinely sophisticated. His assessment of the inspection, that a credentialed handler team with a canine unit was a procedural courtesy, a box to check, a Terran protocol to be accommodated without particular expectation of result, was not an unreasonable assessment based on the information available to him. He had his arrays. He had his 3 sweeps. He had 67 compound classes and calibrated detection thresholds, and a complete technical readout that said, clean. What he didn't have was the right category for what Sergeant is. The Verath Collective, I have been told by the liaison specialists who deal with them regularly, think in hierarchies that are very specific about manufacture. Things made by intention are assessed on their specifications. Things that grow or are born are assessed on their apparent size, their apparent armament, their apparent threat posture. The taxonomy is clean and it mostly works, because most things fit into it clearly enough. Sergeant doesn't fit. He's not manufactured, so you can't assess him on specs. He's not large and he has no apparent armament, and his threat posture is chin on paws, tail at a slow arc, entirely unbothered, the least threatening thing in most rooms he enters. The taxonomy says, small, unarmed, non-threatening, Earth-origin domestic animal. Below notice. The taxonomy doesn't have a category for a thing that is, in the most important dimension for the work being done, operating at a level that all your manufactured technology cannot reach. This is not unique to the Verath. I have watched human officers make the same error. I have watched inspection personnel with brand new scanner arrays look at Sergeant and think, the dog is the backup. The dog is the formality. The dog is the part of this process that we're doing because the core protocol requires it, not because it adds anything the arrays don't already give us. I used to correct this out loud in my first 2 years in the Corps, and then I stopped because the operational evidence accumulates on its own. You don't need to argue for the Beagle. The Beagle argues for himself by doing the work. Sergeant doesn't know about any of this either. He doesn't know about the taxonomy error or the manufacture hierarchy or the gap between what he appears to be and what he is. He knows about corridors. He knows about target compounds. He knows about the particular chemical profile that means, this is the thing, sit down, wait for the handler. He's been doing it for 6 years. He will go on doing it until the day he doesn't, because working animals don't have a more complex philosophy than the work itself, and that is, I have come to believe, one of the cleanest philosophical positions available. There is the work. There is the competence to do the work. There is the doing of it. Everything else is noise. What Sergeant is capable of, the monograph says, cannot be replicated by any currently manufactured sensor array at any production cost. It is a function of biological architecture that took millions of years to develop and hundreds of years of selective breeding to refine and 14 months of targeted training to align with a specific operational purpose. It works not because it was designed to, but because it is, constitutively, what it is. The instrument of the old precision. The thing that doesn't need to be built, because it already exists. Vell stood in that corridor and looked at the open panel and the 47 composite charges, and he made a very fast recalibration. I have thought about what that recalibration felt like, from the inside. Not the public face of it, the controlled bearing, the composed exit, the professional return to operational function. The interior version. What it is like to have held with complete confidence a specific model of what something is, and to have the model demonstrated to be wrong, not partially, not in some minor respect, but in the central respect, the one that mattered for the work at hand. I don't think it was pleasant. I don't think it needed to be pleasant. The most useful recalibrations rarely are. What I think, and this is not in any incident report, And I'm writing it here because it belongs somewhere even if it doesn't belong in an official document, is that Vel is a better officer after that corridor than he was before it. Not because he was humiliated or because he was taught a lesson, because he now has a data point he didn't have, a data point that says, your taxonomy has a gap. The gap is here. The thing that fell through the gap was this today. In the future you will know to look for what you cannot categorize. That is what good reconnaissance does. It tells you what you didn't know was there. Sergeant did the reconnaissance. The Orin 9 survey is on the calendar for 4 months from now. Vault's secondary inquiry came through official channels, correctly formatted, legitimately authenticated, which is either a coincidence or evidence that the collective learns from its data points. I have filed the availability confirmation. Sergeant is certified and current and available. We will go. We will board whatever vessel the collective assigns to the joint survey. There will be a delegation. There will very likely be sensor arrays. The collective's technical command division is not going to abandon its arrays because one Beagle outperformed them once. That would be the wrong lesson. The right lesson is, run the arrays and run the Beagle, because the arrays and the Beagle are finding different things, and you want everything found. Whether the new delegation will have absorbed that lesson before we board or whether they'll need to learn it on site, that I don't know. Doesn't matter, for operational purposes. Sergeant will walk the corridor and do the work regardless of what the delegation thinks about it in advance. He always does. I closed the last of the follow-up documentation and filed it in the secure queue. Outside the viewport in my office, Warden Station's exterior lights were cycling into the standard rotation that passes out here for something like a day-night distinction, even though there's no sun on the relevant schedule, and the cycle is entirely administrative. A convention. A way of marking time that the personnel aboard need, because humans are circadian animals and circadian animals need their days marked, even artificial ones. Sergeant was in the kennel section, asleep probably. He has no trouble with artificial day-night cycles. He sleeps when the work is done. I turned off my desk lamp. In 4 months, the Orin 9 corridor, whatever's in the walls. Sergeant will find it.